morning to those on the West Coast. We're Genscape's happy to present a second in a series of webinars this fall, winter, and early spring about RFS2. And today's webinar is titled 2013 EPA RFS2 Heating Oil Rule Demystified. The reason why we titled this webinar as it is that there's been a lot of conversation about the new EPA ruling that expands the definition of heating oil and a lot of questions about what it means. So today we hope to bring some clarity and some simplification to the open questions that are out there. And speaking of questions, we appreciate your questions. We think the question and answer sessions are very helpful to everyone in attendance at the webinar. So please feel free to type to submit your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll answer the questions at the end, and all the questions will be treated anonymously. So we appreciate you participating in the webinar in that way. And now for some brief introductions. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Susan Olson. I'm the VP of Products here at Genscape for Ag and Biofuels. I work in the Genscape Ag and Biofuels business development and also do a lot of work with QAP and RFS2, and I'm our primary liaison with the EPA. My background is in product development, engineering, and research and development. So, and I'm pleased to introduce my co-speaker today, Larry Schaefer, who's a principal at the Diamond Group. He founded the group, and he's one of the main architects of RFS2 for biomass-based diesel. So, Larry, are you on with us today?
I am. Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. You know, I want to, again, welcome everybody today, and thanks for joining this educational webinar. We've had more than 160 participants register for today, and we look forward to presenting the material on heating oil. So we know your time's valuable, and we expect to cover the material in about 45 minutes or less, and we want to leave a good amount of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Larry, I just, before we get kicking into the material today, I just thought that you know, I know you've worked a lot with this heating oil rule that's had a long history. It was published as a direct final rule back in 2012 and then came back out of the rulemaking status and then back in again. So I thought maybe you could just share with us a little bit of kind of your experience with the pathway to this becoming a final rule.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Back in 2012, EPA was interested in trying to put together a parallel rule or a parallel program where fuels that are used in the marketplace or may be used in the marketplace or new fuels that could be created and used in the marketplace that are not heating oil could get some type of a credit, a renewable fuels program credit under the RFS for using fuel much like a heating oil. So I've been working with EPA for a couple years now on heating oil generally and this proposal. There's been a lot of discussion back and forth, clearly from a biodiesel perspective. There are a number of implications in the heating oil space that I think we were able to iron out with EPA through this process. And I think at the end of the day, EPA actually was able to put together a pretty good program to allow other types of things that are in the marketplace to be identified to be used in boilers and other things that heat buildings. So I think we're personally I was pretty happy that they finalized this rule and allowed new options for RFS compliance. So it's a pretty good place to be in at this point. So thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, it's exciting to hear about that and new possibilities for renewable fuels in that space. So. For those of you that have maybe not attended one of our webinars before, Genscape is the world's leading provider of real-time monitored information, and our goal really is to enable better functioning markets. We do this in a unique way, and we do a lot of our information gathering through proprietary monitoring and analytics. We actually measure more than 1 billion points every day. So we've got about 230 employees. Our headquarters are where I am today in Louisville, Kentucky, and we have offices all over the nation and across the world. So our client base includes 46 obligated parties and 40 renewable fuel producers. We're QAP registered with the EPA for all fuel types and countries of origin. We've seen a lot of growth in our QAP client base the last quarter of this year. I think more and more producers are finding that their RIN values have improved, and they're also finding that an increasing number of counterparties are starting to require or saying that they will require QAP in 2014. So we also do RFS2 registration assistance, LCFS registration and integrity management, and also land use change assessments in this space. So I wanted to quickly mention our partners. Murex is a RIN marketer out of Dallas and Houston, Texas. Lee Enterprises Consulting does engineering and RIN training services. Christensen and Associates performs attestation services for Genscape, and Progressive Fuels Limited is a brokerage service for RINs. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be going through today. We'll talk first about what's new, so the motivation for the rule, expanding heating oil scope with fuel oil, and then talk about the old and new definitions and try to bring some clarity to what heating oil actually means under RFS2. We'll review the new registration, record keeping, and reporting requirements for fuel oil, and then the impact on renewable fuel producers in the marketplace, including risk management strategies for fuel oil RIN owners and also those that generate those RINs, and then leave plenty of time for question and answer. So just to get started and to add to what Larry said earlier, so what motivated this rule, and this is really coming out of the commentary out in front of the actual rule itself that the EPA published. They really honed in on three things. One of those things was to increase the production and use of renewable fuels by introducing new sources of fuel through new types of fuel producers to the RFS program. Through doing this, they mentioned that they could increase the cost effectiveness of implementing RFS2 through addition of fuel types. And they also mentioned that they provided a means in doing this for certain industry demonstrated capabilities that could now participate as fuel producers and RIN generators as part of RFS2. Larry, I mean, can you expand on this any or think of any other things here that you know may have contributed to this rule coming about?
Yeah, I think just very simply, there's a lot of ingenuity in the marketplace. There's a lot of folks that have products that can be used to heat buildings in the marketplace today, especially from the perspective of trying to create new fuels, new renewable fuels for today's marketplace. So it's very difficult to put those fuels into today's heating oil. Although that they could be used for very similar circumstances. So I think what EPA was simply trying to do is trying to figure out ways within the regulatory structure to be able to provide regulatory RIN credit, if you will, for many of these other new ideas that are out there and that technically qualify for the Renewable Fuels Program but didn't really have a home in the heating oil space. So a lot of the push on this program was from those companies and those folks who have an opportunity to heat buildings, to heat places, be used in boilers, those types of things, but not specifically be heating oil. So, and I think that's what we've seen mostly from EPA is a parallel path, if you will, to be able to use something that's not a transportation fuel and still get renewable fuels credit for it.
Got it. I mean, certainly this presents an economic incentive with the RINs, and we can talk a little bit more in the when we talk about the marketplace. But yeah, I think those are great points. Thanks. So jumping right into it, let's talk about what's new in terms of the fuel oil definition. So, and actually, what is new is basically in a sentence is that the scope of the heating oil definition according to RFS2 in 40 CFR Part 80 is being expanded. So I thought what we would do today is start with the old definition and then look at the new definition and then see what is different. So with the old definition, heating oil means, and this is actually, when I say old, it's actually the existing definition. So the new definition will become effective here in just a few days, December 23rd of 2013. But right now, in terms of the existing, or what will very soon be the old definition, heating oil means a fuel that meets the definition according to another part of the 40 CFR Part 80, which is 80.2 CCC. and it basically said that heating oil means any number 1 or number 2 or non-petroleum diesel blend that is sold for the purposes that are listed here on the slide, and is commonly or commercially known or sold as heating oil, fuel oil, and similar trade names. It also specifically excludes jet fuel, kerosene, or MVN RLM diesel fuel. So that's the old or existing definition. So what's new here? The new definition of heating oil now includes a second paragraph, which says heating oil also means a fuel oil that is used to heat interior spaces of homes or buildings and to control ambient climate for human comfort. So, and basically you'll notice that there isn't any commonly or commercially known standards mentioned here, but there are only really some very loose, I would say, specifications on what chemically or physically qualifies as heating oil. Larry, unless you have anything, I was just going to jump to the next slide.
Nope, go ahead.
So what I thought we would do now is to clarify, first of all, the old definition, or just the paragraph 1, which will still remain as a definition of heating oil, and then we'll bring some clarity also, hopefully, to the new definition. So what qualifies as heating oil under 40 CFR 80.2 CCC and meets RFS2 standards for RIN generation? Well, in the definition itself, there are definitely restrictions for use and also trade names that are commonly and commercially known, so the purpose into which the fuel is sold, and also what it can't be. So let's talk a little bit about the other portions of the definition. So the renewable portion of a diesel blend would qualify for RIN generation if it meets the definitions of number 1 or number 2 fuel oil once it's blended in. So common commercial standards for number 1 or number 2 fuel oil are ASTM D975 and 396. So for example, if you were blending biodiesel at a 5% or less rate into number 1 or number 2 fuel oil, the renewable portion of that would meet RFS2 standards for RIN generation. The other thing that would meet, that basically for RFS2 would meet the standards, would be what's called the renewable portion of a non-petroleum diesel blend, and there's a very specific definition for that also in 40 CFR 80.2. It basically says that it's a diesel fuel that contains at least 80% monoalkyl esters of long-chain fatty acids derived from vegetable oils or animal fats. So essentially you're talking there between biodiesel B80 and B99 blends, for example. I'm not to say that there's not other things that could be blended into fuel oil, but specifically just to give an example here about biodiesel. So it must be blended at least 80%, and it also must be blended. So we'll talk in a little bit about what about the in-between blends between B6 and B79, and also about the neat fuel use of biodiesel. One point I wanted to make very clear here, and the EPA made this point very clearly, is that all fuels previously included in the definition of heating oil continued to be included as heating oil under 40 CFR 80.1401 for the purposes of the RFS program. So the rule was intended to expand the definition of heating oil and not to contract any current existing uses. Larry, anything that you want to add there or can think would be helpful?
Yes, just for simplification purposes, I think if I'm looking at this rule today, I look at it and say, do I meet definition 1? And if I meet definition 1, then I don't have to go on to definition 2 from what the heating oil definition is. If I don't meet definition 1, then I should look towards definition 2 and see if I meet that definition. And if I meet definition 2, then there are rules that I need to follow in order to be compliant with the program, consistent with the program. But that's kind of the easy way to look at it, is understand that, okay, am I heating oil under definition 1, yes or no? If the answer is no, then you still might qualify, and you still might be qualified as a fuel oil if you meet definition 2. And that's kind of an easier way to try to think about looking at it from that perspective.
That's a great way to look at it. I think, as you bring up, and we'll talk in detail about these requirements when we get to the registration portion of the talk, but there are more restrictive requirements in terms of record keeping and registration for the definition number 2. So if you qualify for definition number 1, certainly from a compliance standpoint, it's easier to get through all the compliance necessities with definition 1. So again, a little bit of clarity about the old definition. So something that came out of the original direct final rule was EPA actually came out with a document where they responded, and they always document this, but responded to comments clarifying heating oil usage. And what they said in one part of this response to comments was that they confirmed that the inclusion of the new heating oil provision for fuel oils does not impact the current definition and use of biodiesel as heating oil, which we brought up in the previous slide. But the thing that was really, I think, key here for the industry is that they said even where that biodiesel is used for process heat, power generation, or in stationary sources. And the references there, they also make the note that producers must separate RINs when it is used by the producer as heating oil for process heat or power. So if you're using, heating oil definition 1 in your plant to power boilers or provide process heat, those kind of things, you actually have to separate the RINs when you do that. So and then the other thing I wanted to point out is that, as Larry was talking about, qualifying what you're doing as definition 1 or definition 2, if you're using a B6 to B79 blend of biodiesel, or you're using neat biodiesel as heating oil, right now that has to meet right now you're meeting the paragraph 2 definition of heating oil. So Larry, I know you've got a lot of knowledge about both of these items here, and I think they're very important to the industry, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. For purposes of B6 to B79, and people do all different types of things for a lot of different reasons, and I'm not sure that I would even understand why somebody would use that blend ratio for purposes of heating oil. So in most cases, folks will be using a B5 blend or a B80 to a B99 blend for heating oil purposes, and fit nicely into definition 1 if you're doing biodiesel. However, if you happen to be doing something else, then you would fit into the B6 to B79 category or the B100 category. And if that's what you're doing and you want to qualify for the heating oil definition, then you would, at this point, you would be required to use definition 2. So just kind of keep those things in mind. We do a lot of different things in the biodiesel space for lots and lots of different reasons, and just simply the blend level could trigger a different definition. So I think we just need to be aware and conscientious of that at this point. So I think, Susan, I'm just going to leave it at that for now. There's lots of additional questions that people may have about that, and we can take those at the end, perhaps.
Sure, sure.
And clearly, they can give you or me a call later on as well if they want to discuss that further as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing on this slide that, I think that it's interesting that, some of these, when you start researching some of these documents, like the response to comments, you start to find things where the EPA, basically writes down a position on a certain topic. I mean, from your experience, Larry, I mean, how should those points be interpreted by somebody who's looking at the rule? I mean, is that equivalent to an EPA position, or kind of how do you gauge the weight of that kind of statement from the comments?
Well, again, I think some of that probably varies quite a bit, kind of depending on what the question of the day is. But generally, if EPA provides guidance in the regulatory rule, in the preamble of the regulatory rule, and what have you, then you can pretty well read into that to make sure that they are that their logic follows, and that the words of the regulation match up with some of the plain language of what they're saying.
Sure.
What I normally do is I normally cross-check that with the actual regulatory language.
Sure. Right.
As well, and if there's a discrepancy, then we usually try to go and get clarification with EPA. If there's not a discrepancy, then fairly straightforwardly, then that guidance would be fairly straightforward, and you can use that guidance. But if you're in a situation where you have questions, though, that's kind of the hard part is and EPA doesn't always like to clarify those things. So what we try to do, and I think, Susan, what you probably try to do as well, is you try to get the best information that you can in order to put yourself in a position so that there aren't any questions when it finally gets to EPA. And sometimes that takes a little bit more than just reading the regulation, and you need to reach out to other folks and other organizations that are able to kind of help you interpret kind of what some of that plain language looks like.
Absolutely. I mean, for us, it's certainly a community process. You know, we certainly try to, you know, reach out to others that are study and inform and you know, and basically have a lot of knowledge on these subjects, and then also approach, like you said, the EPA with an informed position and question if there's still some doubt in mind of what the position is. So yeah, I think it's important to talk about that process. So I appreciate that. And to talk a little bit about so now we'll switch over. We talked about what the old definition or the existing definition until December 23rd is, and we can talk now about the new definition. So I thought maybe one way to talk about the new definition would be what are examples of fuel oil under the new definition. So, you know, basically, again, this is not a chemical type specification definition. So as a matter of fact, the EPA is not requiring physical specifications for the additional fuel oil category. Beyond the requirement, they say that it be a fuel oil, and meaning in this sense of the word that it is a liquid at 60 degrees Fahrenheit and an atmosphere pressure, and it can contain no more than 2.5% mass solids. The final rule preamble mentions industry standard specs for fuel oils that could qualify. They mention ASTM D396, which is a fuel oil spec, ASTM D7666 for triglycerides, I believe it's burner fuels, and ASTM D7544, which is pyrolysis of liquid biofuels. And so I think that what naturally follows is the question is, you know, will new RFS2 pathways have to be created to generate RINs for this new fuel type? And the answer is no. So again, I wanted to emphasize that the expansion of the expansion of the definition of heating oil was the intent of this final rule. So existing pathways that designate heating oil as the fuel type under RFS2 will now include the expanded definition of heating oil, which is fuel oil. But I just wanted to bring out as a point that all existing pathway requirements, including feedstock and processing, must be met, as well as all other RFS2 requirements. So for instance, you know, this is still a renewable fuel standard, so you couldn't have a petroleum-based substance as a heating oil product and try to qualify it for RIN generation. So this is an expansion of the definition of heating oil under the current existing standards. Now, if you didn't have a pathway for something, certainly you could apply and use the process to apply to the EPA for a new pathway. But just to be clear, all the existing pathways designating heating oil will now include this expanded definition. Larry, I'm going to flip over to the next page that has the pathways, but I thought if you have some thoughts there to share, that would be great. I think Larry may be on mute.
No, I'm here. I'm here. I was looking at the slide.
I'm sorry.
So, you know,
I can back it up too, but I was just going to switch over to the other slide, and everybody
right.
can kind of take a look. And what we've got here are basically the existing pathways. So,
right. And go ahead, Susan.
Well, that's it. That's all I was going to say. These are the existing pathways. You know, again, it's small print, so I thought maybe the folks on the phone could take a gander at this while you're talking a little bit about, you know, if you have, I know you have some really, you know, good ways to simplify and look at this final rule. So anything regarding the pathways would be helpful.
Yeah, and sometimes things just aren't simple when it comes to the EPA and the Renewable Fuels Program. But but generally speaking, you know, there are 4 categories that you have to think about and worry about to be a qualifying fuel under the Renewable Fuels Program, and they're set out on this table: fuel type, feedstock, production process, and what have you. And then you end up with some type of a D code at the end of the day. So generally, if you fit into one of those categories and you're already in one of those categories, then as Susan was talking about, you don't need to go develop a new pathway, but you can fit into a current pathway, generally speaking, for purposes of this rule. There clearly are going to be instances where you're not on this list and you're not already in the list, so you'd have to go develop a new pathway. But if you're doing something and you have a feedstock and you have a fuel that has already been on this list and has been approved by EPA, then you may qualify for definition 2 from the heating oil definition, and if that's the case, then you should take a serious look at it to determine whether or not you want to use your product as that meets that new definition. So that's my simplification, Susan. So if you want to add to that, please do.
Oh, thanks. That's extremely helpful. So moving on to one other point of clarity about the new definition is that basically the fuel oil is defined by its usage and those other, the very short list of physical properties of the actual liquid itself for RIN generation. So I think one way to say this is that the newly added definition of fuel oil is not by a certain voluntary standard like an ASTM standard or chemical composition. Instead, the fuel oil is really defined mostly by its use. So the EPA, in its final rule said the fuel oil must be used to heat interior spaces of homes or buildings to control ambient climate for human comfort. So one of the things they made a special note about is, this was intended to qualify as quote-unquote home heating oil, but commercial buildings also count. But it still must be used to heat areas where people live, work, recreate, or conduct other activities. They explicitly say that process heat and electricity are not allowed as end uses for RIN generation for the paragraph 2 definition of heating oil, which is just the fuel oil definition under 80.1401. So Larry, I think that this is kind of a unique type of definition in that, it doesn't have a certain chemical standard that qualifies as but fuel use. Kind of what are your thoughts on that, and any ways people should be thinking about this?
Yes, Susan, I would just kind of go back to the original ideas and thoughts of the Renewable Fuels Program and the definitions that EPA was given by Congress. EPA has a program that transportation fuel and heating oil qualify for RIN generation purposes. Things like electricity generation and process heat, for example, are not predetermined qualifying uses under the Renewable Fuels Program. So you see some of the I call them nitpicky details that EPA has to go through for purposes of this type of a rule, because Congress told them what types of fuels should be qualifying, and generally process heating and electricity are not qualifying uses of renewable fuels for purposes of transportation fuel and heating oil. So that's why you see some of these distinctions between, do I have to use it in a place where somebody is heating a building where people reside, rather than just heating a big old Quonset that has a bunch of tractors in it, for example. I mean, the rules are just generally different for those purposes. So they're not always intuitive, and it's not always as straightforward as one would like it to be. But I think EPA has been fairly consistent about its application of RIN generation for renewable fuels purposes. So that's why you see some of these strange nuances on trying to decipher these definitions sometimes. Right,
right. I think those are excellent points. One thing I wanted to point out is that if economically it made sense to use a renewable product that meets the definition of fuel oil for some purpose outside of this, it doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you can't generate RINs for it. So, and there's actually, when we get into the record keeping, there are provisions to talk about how much fuel oil you're using for the RFS2 RIN generation sense and how much you're not. So if you had an economic reason to sell something that qualified as fuel oil for a burner as process heat electricity, it's not that you can't do that. You just can't generate RINs based on that. So just wanted to point that out, because I know that, in some situations, maybe 80% of your market, you can sell this into, a situation where you could use it as, qualifying for RIN generation, and maybe 20% you can't. So, is that allowable? And based on what the EPA's laid out, it looks like they've made provisions in the record keeping and reporting for that. Okay, I think that now we talked about the definition, so we'll get into what I call the 3 R's, the registration, record keeping, and reporting. So these are all new requirements that we'll be talking about, and these are only for the paragraph 2 definition of heating oil, so what we've been referring to throughout as fuel oil. In other words, it doesn't meet the paragraph 1 part of the definition. You go to paragraph 2, what you're doing meets that definition, so these requirements will just be for that. And also, all other RFS2 requirements must still be met, including registered pathways, as we've emphasized a lot throughout this talk, and all the other requirements. So, but let's talk about the new things that are required for registration. So first of all, the RIN generator must submit an affidavit stating that the fuel oil for which RINs were generated must be used for heating interior spaces of homes or buildings, and again, the controlling ambient climate comfort or ambient climate for human comfort, and no other purpose. So I mean, just breaking this down a little bit. So you've got the RIN generator must do it. You must submit an affidavit, and you're basically affirming with this affidavit that for the fuel oil you've sold into the market for which RINs were generated, you must be using it for the purposes outlined and no other purposes. So that's the affidavit that the RIN generator, typically the producer, must submit. The other thing the RIN generator must submit is affidavits from end users of the fuel that attest effectively the same thing. Fuel oil for which RINs were generated must be used for those purposes and no other purpose. And then also the end user must acknowledge that any other use of the fuel oil would violate EPA regulations and subject to the end user to civil penalties under the Clean Air Act. So, and just a point, and you know, this is just generally about registration materials, but the EPA has stated in 40 CFR 80.1450, which talks a lot about the registration materials, that registration materials must be accepted 60 days before generating RINs. So, you know, just be aware of that. You know, there could be that, you know, potentially if your registration materials, these affidavits are accepted, then there may be some way for the EPA to give you an allowance to produce RINs before that 60-day window. But right now, that's the way that the registration requirements are stated, so I just want to make everyone on the call aware of that. So, Larry, I'll just flip it over to you.
Thanks, Susan. So just to re-summarize, I think a little bit about what Susan said is EPA uses this affidavit process to determine whether or not you are complying with the regulation. So the RIN generator has to have an affidavit, and the entity that is using your fuel has to attest to an affidavit as well. So those are the two basic requirements that you have to have, and if you don't have that in your portfolio of registration materials, then you cannot generate RIN. So, and again, what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that you acknowledge and that you know and you are aware of how the fuel is being used and what the uses are for, and that it meets the definition of the requirements, and that's what the attest affidavit is all about. So it's, if you have it lined up and you have it streamlined and it's set up, it shouldn't be a burdensome task, but they are requiring you to make sure that you actually know what you're doing on this stuff. So you can't really mess it up if you're following the rules. So you clearly could cheat on your affidavit if you choose to, but that's not what we're interested in. But they really are trying to make sure that they check the boxes and that you check the boxes so that it's being used for its intended use and purpose.
Right, right. I mean, and it does seem, although it's not, you know, in terms of the paperwork in and of itself, you know, the registration is not too taxing, but that definitely would be a bit of a conversation, it seems like, between the producer and the end user to, you know, to talk them through what the requirements are. You know, are there any, Larry, do you have any thoughts about, you know, kind of that conversation or any experience with people having those conversations with end users and what might be helpful? I mean, somebody like a trade association, or, you know, are there entities out there that have been helpful in situations like this before?
Well, a lot of it comes down to case-by-case purposes and analysis. I think that there are a lot of users in the space that have boilers that possibly could be used to heat buildings where people reside or work and what have you. So from a producer point of view, I think what you're going to be interested in, trying to find those folks in the marketplace that have the ability to use your product, and you generally can find them. I mean, there are some really interesting relationships that are created. Then once you find those folks in the marketplace, then you have to begin to have the discussion about what the definition is and what meets those definitions, and kind of move that direction. So I don't really have any real good solid examples off the top of my head. I have spoken with a lot of folks who have been working with school systems, who have been working with a lot of municipalities, prison units, those types of things. A lot of these older units that have these boiler systems in place, where an application along these lines really makes a lot of the opportunity makes a lot of sense. Not necessarily that it will actually happen, but the opportunity makes a lot of sense. So when you look at our infrastructure in this country, there clearly are a lot of folks out there that could use something other than their current kerosene fuel supply or something along those lines to heat where people are working or residing.
Sure. No, that makes great sense. So, kind of letting the economics in the market kind of lead the way. I know that there are also, and I don't have any specific things in mind, but I know that you hear more and more about certain, states requiring more renewable fuels within, fuel oils or heating oils. So in those cases, there may be layered incentives or perhaps there may be, layer constraints on, a particular company on being able to blend a certain amount of renewable fuel. So that, that makes perfect sense. We don't usually answer questions to the end, but this question came in, and I think it's perfect continuous of this conversation. So, we have a question that says, the end user must provide the affidavit. So, in this case, kind of what is the end user? The end user, from the way that I understand it, is the person that's actually, the person that has, is going to be using the fuel in an application. So, for instance, if it's like a commercial entity, let's say like a casino or a hotel or something to that extent that's taking the fuel oil. And the question also was, what about residential users of fuel oil? So Larry, kind of we can defer and I can, certainly get more clarity on this, but do you have any thoughts or, at this point on, if this fuel is being distributed, let's say by a heating oil distributor, that, would it be the expectation that the distributor would be able to sign the affidavit, or is the expectation that the actual homeowners would need to sign the affidavit?
Yeah, I think in this case, EPA is going to be pretty specific about the actual homeowner at the end of the day. And I look at it in terms of, for example, I always use the example of the Empire State Building. If you want to go do business with the Empire State Building and they've got a heating system that takes your fuel, then the management team of the Empire State Building would have to sign that affidavit. If you have a group of homes, for example, there might be a community of 10, 20, 30, whatever it might be, and they're all using the same fuel, and you have one distributor, and you go and you check off each and every box, you're clearly going to have a conversation with the homeowners in any way to let them know that you're bringing in a fuel that's different than what they're historically used to. You're going to have that conversation, and you can create an affidavit for that process as you go through that process and get those boxes checked more than anything else. And then the distributor probably can aggregate them and take them back to EPA, which I think would be allowed. I'm not aware of any of those instances, but it doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And I think that's
Sure.
a logical outgrowth or application of a unit system where you might have a handful of homes that are all using the same type of heating oil or fuel oil in this respect.
Right. Yeah, I think that they're pretty, this rule is pretty stringent about it has to be the end user. And as a matter of fact, I've just switch to the slide here to talk about record-keeping requirements. And I'll skip down to the third bullet point here, but one of the things that is stipulated in record-keeping requirements is that producers must keep copies of the contracts documenting fuel oil transfer all the way to the end user. So if they're mid-market parties, then the RFS2 rules will require the RIN generator to keep those intermediate contracts showing the chain of custody from the producer to the end user, and those must be collected and maintained by the producer. I know that this is, one of the things that, in terms of the quality assurance and kind of how this fits in is that, quality assurance providers can be, partners in these sort of things and help, keep things on track with making sure the right documentation is in place to make sure that RIN generation is happening appropriately, that all record keeping is appropriate. So just keep in mind you're not alone in this space, especially if you're affiliated with a QAP provider. And then the other thing that is a record keeping requirement is that product transfer document requirement. So I know that those of you who are out there who are RIN generators or used to receiving PTDs, you know that there are a lot of statements on there depending on, what type of use and end use and those sort of things. So this would, using fuel oil will require a new statement on the product transfer document that basically is a measure to assure that the downstream user understands that this is for heating interior spaces of homes or buildings to control ambient climate comfort and not to be used for process heat or any other purpose. And so the PTD also, as well as the contracts, must be maintained between the producer and the final end user for transfer of title and custody. So, so in other words, this PTD with this designation needs to go all the way to the end user. Larry, I think that we've talked a little bit earlier about these requirements, and it are in addition to the RFS2 record-keeping requirements, and are really trying to keep a tight line on how this fuel oil may be used, within the RFS2 standards. So, it seems like that this is another example of one of those, trying to keep the boundaries pretty tight on it.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with that, and because this rule is so new, and because the application of the rule is so new, if you have an interesting opportunity that is not necessarily specified by the record-keeping requirements, and you have questions about it, I would ask EPA the question before I went ahead and just assume that it would be okay. There are lots of ways to not comply, obviously, and I think that for purposes of this rule and the record-keeping requirements, you just kind of want to be on the right side of the equation, at least until EPA has a better ability to kind of understand what the marketplace is, who's approved, and who can actually use this in a constructive way. So I would be very diligent about dotting my I's and crossing my T's at this point. And if you have an opportunity that you can't find the direct answer to in the regulation, then I would absolutely ask that question to EPA and try to get an answer from them on it before I move forward.
Sure, and also don't hesitate to reach out to Larry or myself for direction going forward. So have a conversation about that. So we've gotten through 2 of the R's. So this is the third R, which is reporting requirements. So there are reporting requirements that are related to the RIN generation, and then there are reporting requirements that are also related to the end use. So on a quarterly basis, the RIN generator has to submit a report with the following categories of information. The first category of information is the total volume of fuel oil produced and sold in units of U.S. gallons, and the other required information, as per what will be the new regulation, is listed in that column, like the single row table below that. So basically, you have to batch per batch for the RINs, identify production date, the D code, the total volume of fuel oil for which RINs were generated, and then the total volume of fuel oil sold. So there's that differentiation between fuel oil sold and the amount of fuel oil sold where RINs were generated. So also the lower heating value that was used, the equivalence value, number of RINs, and the organization name where the fuel oil was used, and also the building location where the fuel oil was used. So again, this is a line-by-line type report with the batch identifier from EMTS being, basically dictating how many rows are in this report. The other thing that has to be submitted on a quarterly basis is a quarterly end user affidavit. So the RIN generator actually must submit this to the EPA, but it has to be an affidavit from the end user. So the affidavit attests the same information as the registration affidavit from the end user of the fuel oil, plus information on each fuel oil, on the fuel oil on each date received, which is the table below. So basically the date received, for each date they receive fuel, they should attest to the quantity in gallons, the quantity used to control human comfort, the blend level, the number of assigned RINs received with that shipment, and then the number of RINs that they separated as an end user of the fuel. So the timing of these reports coincides, by the way, with the quarterly report cycle in the same section of the 40 CFR code. Larry, any thoughts about these reporting requirements?
No, Susan, I think you did a good job. Thanks.
All right, thanks. So kind of wrapping it up here, we'll just briefly touch on some thoughts about the market impact, and then risk management strategies. So, you know, I think three things really came to mind here, and we covered these a little bit in the beginning of the webinar, but we can talk about them a little bit more in an economic sense. So I think that, you know, if you look at the market impact, there's specific mention in the preamble of, you know, potential cellulosic fuels that are out there that may be currently available that could qualify for RIN generation. So there is in the pathways that we showed earlier, there is an example or is an existing pathway for a D7 RIN for cellulosic heating oil. So this could potentially open the door to a source of additional cellulosic RINs from RFS2 fuels that wasn't there before. I think, you know, as Larry had mentioned before, just to add to what he was saying, that this rule expands the possibility for renewable or partially renewable replacements for number 4 or number 6 fuel oil. You know, there may turn out to be economic benefits based on what type of actual, you know, chemical type of composition or where this fuel streams are coming from that could be you know, granted as a you know, a fuel oil under this EPA rule. There also could be stipulations from state governments or even localities that require a certain percentage of fuel to be renewable or meet certain standards. So I think that this certainly expands the possibilities for those replacements. And then with the economics of the RINs, you know, that creates incentives for new renewable types of fuel oil. You know, the RIN is layered on as a potential value over the top of what the actual value of the substance is, so it can incent, you know, incentives for creating new things that are out there. You know, Larry, I know you talked a little bit about each of these, and one of the things that you know, I was curious to kind of pick your brain on a little bit is kind of this idea of new sources for cellulosic RINs and how this might play a role in that, and kind of, you know, other things that the EPA may be doing to try to incent cellulosic fuels coming into the marketplace.
Yeah, I think there are a number of companies, Susan, that are out there that haven't quite perfected cellulosic biofuels yet from a purpose of transportation fuels, but they can get really close on creating a type of fuel that technically qualifies as a cellulosic fuel, but may not be ready for prime time for transportation purposes, but could be used for heating oil purposes, for example, and meeting the definition of definition number 2 that we've talked about. So I think EPA is trying to be expansive in that respect. Clearly, they're trying to help move some technologies forward in a constructive way, and I think this rule affords some folks some opportunity to do that in a constructive way as well. So when you're looking at the biomass sector and the cellulosic sector, there may be some opportunities for you that are prior to actually having a cellulosic transportation fuel, ethanol-based or whatever it might be in the marketplace, where this rule might actually work for you if you have the right user in mind that it could be used somewhere other than in transportation purposes.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, that's a really interesting, you know, insight, because I think that, you know, kind of what I took away from what you're saying is it's a bit of a kind of a bridge between, you know, what's available now and what would actually, you know, be dropped in as a transportation fuel or blended as a transportation fuel. But yet, I mean, in terms of the allowances for heating oil, that this is, you know, fits in there. So that's really that's very insightful. Yeah, I think that makes sense in terms of what the EPA is trying to do on behalf of the producers. So the final point here, and this is actually labeled buyer risk management, but I think that you know, really this, when you're talking about RINs and risk management, you know, ultimately a lot of the liability ultimately comes back to the producer. So really, risk management is not just from the buy side, but also as much or more from the sell side. So so I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the comments in the preamble to the final rule indicated about RIN purchasers and kind of how the EPA views it. So one of the preamble comments indicates that subsequent improper use would not invalidate any RIN. So really the EPA is relying very heavily on the affidavit as a legal document for the end use, to validate the end use of the fuel. So basically what they're saying is that the RIN generating producer is not actually required to track the fuel's use. They must obtain the affidavit from the end user and do all the record keeping in between the production and the end use. And they state actually in the preamble that there still is a slight chance that the fuel, could be associated with, improper use, that the RIN could be associated with improper use once the appropriate certification is made. But once the affidavit is out there and that's registered and the reporting is happening properly, the RIN may be generated and will remain valid regardless of the actual end use. So again, very heavy reliance on the affidavit as the proof that the end use is happening properly. Genscape, as a QAP provider, would collect and analyze the required affidavits as part of the QAP requirements. And also, again, as QAP provider, Genscape acts as a producer or RIN generator's partner in assessing and maintaining these requirements. So, I also wanted to mention that, one of the things we do, for example, is provide templates that can be provided to a producer or a RIN generator, to be able to have resources for being able to produce this documentation. Larry, thoughts on the risk management side of this, or any of the other points there?
No, Susan, I think you did a good job. Thanks.
All right. Well, with that, we have a couple of questions out there. Just wanted to remind everybody that we'll have the QAP Final Rule Frontier webinar next, and coming up in January. However, that date's subject to change. We're going to be holding it the days immediately following the EPA announcement, and I think I just realized by looking at the state, I think it coincides with the last day of the National Biodiesel Conference and Expo. So you'll be getting an updated date for this webinar soon. So we'll be talking about the content and implications, what's changed, and by the way, if you're already registered for our series, you'll have this registration automatically, so you don't necessarily have to re-register. As we conclude here, you'll see a survey pop up. We would love to get your feedback on the webinar and what you would like to hear about future webinars, what we did well, what we could do better. Certainly that kind of feedback really guides how we move through these things in the future and can provide a better service to the industry. So Larry, we do have a question that came in, and please, everybody that's out there, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. These will be anonymous, so we won't mention your name that you asked it. The question that's out there is that this participant said that there was an EPA audit wherein they requested a number of certifications from the company, one of which was that we certify that we would not be using biodiesel for heating oil. And they asked if this new ruling negates our need to comply with this certification requirement. So it seems like this producer was a biodiesel, or this participant was a biodiesel producer affiliated with a company that produced biodiesel, and got some guidance from the EPA that they could not be using the biodiesel for heating oil. I mean, I'll take a quick crack at it, Larry. I think that, based on kind of the current definition, that it would have had to be blended to specifications to meet the definition of heating oil, either B5 or less, or between B80 and B99. So in neat form, certainly there would have been some complications that wouldn't have qualified it as a blend. Can you think of anything, Larry, that might have changed or anything that might have caused this interaction?
Yeah, and I'll just qualify my answer a little bit. Not knowing the dates of when the audit happened or any of those types of things. Clearly, I think both Susan and I think that you could use biodiesel under definition 2 and meet that definition of fuel oil and or heating oil, if you will. But B100 it doesn't really fit into definition number 1 of heating oil, and I think most folks recognize that, and that could be the point that the EPA was trying to make, is that heating oil is heating oil, which contains a biodiesel blend, and we call it bioheat, and that's heating oil, and it's still the end product is heating oil, and that qualifies for the program. So I think it just depends on what your blend level is and what your ambitions are. If you plan to use B100, then I think you just have to take a step back and think about it and say, does B100 fit into definition 1 or definition 2? And I think it's clear that it fits into definition 2. It may not be so clear that it fits into definition 1.
Right, and definition 2 is new, so and actually just coming into effect on the 23rd. And the participant actually clarified that the blend was a B20 blend, so indeed I think that it prior to the issuance, or prior to the finalization, of this rule that technically, because of the way that the non-petroleum diesel blend is defined, it would have to be 80 or above, or it could fit in as below, B5 or up to B5, because that meets the actual fuel oil standard number 1 or number 2 from ASTM, D975 or 396.
Right, and on that point, I'm very much aware that, for example, the National Biodiesel Board has inquired specifically about B20 and whether or not it fits into Definition 1 or Definition 2 for these purposes, and the National Biodiesel Board hasn't received an answer back on that question yet. So that question, for purposes of Definition 1, is still being examined by EPA, and when there is an answer, I'm hopeful it will trickle down to all of us. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for the moment.
Well, it's great to hear. I mean, certainly the more qualification, the better for the heating oil, standpoint for renewable fuel producers. So we had another question, and so the question is, what RFS2 pathway is identified for D7666 or D7544 type fuels? And so those were the two. I'm pretty certain that this participant is asking about the ASTM standards D7666 or D7544. One of them, that first standard, has to do with triglyceride-based fuels, and the other one is pyrolysis resulting, I think they're called biofuels or bioblends or something to that effect. So I think that the RFS2 pathways, and I'll just go back to this chart here. The RFS2 pathways aren't specific for the paragraph 2 definition of heating oil, which is fuel oil. They're not specific to any type of ASTM standard. Basically, they have to, the chemical substance that qualifies has to fit into one of these existing pathways for heating oil that are shown here in the table, or there has to be another determination of the EPA of an additional pathway through the petition process for that type of heating oil. But the concept is that the new rule basically expands the definition of heating oil to include fuel oils. And the EPA mentioned in the preamble that those two standards that the participant asked about are substances that could qualify as fuel oil so long as all the other pathway qualifications are met. So for instance, you have to use an appropriate feedstock for the pathway, you have to use the production process requirements for the pathway, and you have to be generating RINs for that D code. So really, there aren't specific pathways established for those standards. It's just that those are types of fluids that might qualify as fuel oil if all other RFS2 requirements are met. Larry, thoughts on that one?
No, I think you did a good job.
All right. Well, last call for questions. That was our last question in the bunch here. And Larry, any other closing thoughts?
None at this time. Good job,
right.
Susan.
Yeah, you too, Larry. I really appreciate you, speaking at the webinar today and bringing your expertise to the table. So we're very hopeful that we were helpful in providing some additional information about the new heating oil rule. Certainly, please feel free to follow up. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar and slides to everyone that registered. So we'll do that. And if you could please fill out the survey, we would certainly appreciate your feedback. So thanks so much, everyone, for participating. And we appreciate it, and I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season if